I wanted this tutorial to cover how I typically go about drawing poses, and I also wanted it to cover the types of poses that I actually use when I'm drawing. So this ranges from standing poses to sitting poses to floating poses. But the first thing I want to emphasize is that reference is your friend. You can obviously find a lot of amazing pose reference online. Some notable websites are quickposes.com, lineofaction.com, and DeviantArt. Adorka Stock is an example of a really amazing stock account on DeviantArt with tons and tons of amazing pose reference, so I highly recommend checking her out. And if you use software like Clip Studio Paint, you can also play around with posing 3D mannequins to a specific pose that you like. They can be very useful for getting the exact look that you are wanting. What I have come to really appreciate, I guess in the past year or so though, is that often the easiest and quickest way to get the exact reference that I need is to just pose myself and take a quick photo. If I have a very specific pose in mind, sometimes I can spend hours trying to find the reference that I need from the internet, or I can spend a bunch of time trying to pose a 3D model. But really the fastest option is just for me to try and make as close to that pose as possible myself and take a photo. This can help with specific parts of a drawing, like maybe I have a very specific hand pose that I need to get that I can't find online, so I just take a picture myself, or it can be the whole figure. For this tutorial, I took some reference of myself for us to use. Since we don't need super HD photos for something like this, the easiest way to get reference is to just set my camera up to record and then grab some screenshots of the poses that I liked. It's not the highest quality, but since we are just using it as reference, we're not like doing photo manipulation or anything, this works perfectly fine. You can do this too by recording a little video and then taking screenshots if you don't have someone there to take actual photos of you. We're going to make sure to look at some of this reference, and we'll draw from some of this reference. And then later, once we have a little practice and a feel for the pose drawings, we can try out sketching some poses from imagination. So the way that I approach drawing poses in my characters is very gesture-based, so it can feel quite loose and flowy. I don't like to get caught up in all of the mechanics too early, because then it can feel kind of stiff. I prefer to start out with something that's very loose, and it might even seem pretty messy. I'm just trying to get the flow and the feeling of it. One important note first: when you look at a figure and start to draw, try to not get caught up in the individual pieces of anatomy, and instead see the whole body as one form. If you find this challenging when you start observing and drawing, it might be worth zooming out a little bit or taking a step back from the canvas. Sometimes that little bit of distance can help you observe the overall shape instead of getting caught up in individual pieces or details too early. We can help train our eye to see the whole form by identifying rhythms of the form. This is where lines of action come in. The line of action helps you find that flow. Often, I will draw a line of action that loosely follows the spine, but then extends through the head and maybe through the leg. It doesn't always have to be the spine though. If you notice there's a flow through the arms, the legs, or maybe from an arm through the body and down to an ankle, really the possibilities are endless and there's no set rule. This comes down to what you see as the flow of the pose. A line of action is just a general guideline of the flow to help you see and get a feel for the rhythm of the pose. Once I have the lines of action down, I add the angle of the hips and the angle of the shoulders. Now, it's very important to remember that the angle of the hips and the shoulders should be tilted in opposite directions of each other most of the time. If they're parallel, that can make the pose feel really stiff. Another important note is that when a person is standing, the leg that is bearing most of the weight will push that same hip higher. So that is just a good thing to remember when you're drawing standing characters, is whatever leg is bearing the weight, that hip is typically going to be angled higher. Okay, so I know it doesn't look like much, but at this point, the most important part of drawing the pose is done, in my opinion. Next, I like to add a simple torso shape. This helps me feel a bit more how the character might be twisting or bending in their spine. One way that can really help simplify the torso is to think of it like a squishy bean. The top of the torso, like the rib cage, is one circle. The bottom of the torso, which is like the hip bones, is another circle. And then in between those circles is the squishy part of the bean, where most of the bending and twisting can happen in the torso. When I'm drawing a figure or a pose, I don't always go through with the two circles of the bean, but the basic idea is still there. I just tend to simplify it quite a bit more because I've kind of practiced drawing these beans before, and so I don't always draw the whole bean every single time I draw a pose. But if you are just starting out, I would recommend practice drawing these beans, practice them twisting and bending, just to give an idea of how the torso works. At this point, I will usually draw a very rough indication of the head and maybe what direction the head is facing or how it's angled, but I don't put too much thought into it at this point. Next, I move on to the legs and arms. Part of the movement of the legs and arms might already be guided by the line of action. To start out, I try and stay pretty loose and pretty simple, mostly wanting to get the general gesture of the arms and legs down without worrying too much about proportions or specific anatomy yet. I'm still trying to think about the figure as a whole unit, not separate pieces. So I want the arms and legs to flow well with the torso. Sometimes this means that when I first sketch in something like an arm, it is curvy and it looks more like an octopus tentacle. But that's okay, don't worry, because as I hone in on the pose, I can come in and add the actual structure later on. What's important at this stage is to just get that flow and the feeling of the pose. It's also important to mention that I don't necessarily stick exactly to the pose reference all the time. For a pose like this, in the photo I'm sitting, but I'm thinking for this pose, it's actually kind of more of a fantasy, like floating sort of pose situation. And so I'm really trying to lean into that and just exaggerate that aspect of it a little bit more while still using the reference to guide me, but not feeling tied down by the reference. Once I have basically a curvy stick figure drawn and I'm fairly happy with the pose and how it's flowing, I then can start adding in the basic shapes. For themes like arms and legs, I roughly think of cylinders and what direction the cylinder would be facing. So if an arm is kind of coming at you, then the cylinder rings around the cylinder will be kind of in that perspective. It just helps me think about the figure in a little bit more of a 3D shape. Now, I usually don't draw in very specific, like geometric shapes when I draw poses and figures. I think that can be a helpful exercise. It's just not something that I usually do for every one of my drawings. Like, I don't block in the whole figure with spheres and cylinders and boxes and all of that kind of stuff. I think it's a fine exercise. It's just like not usually how I work. But if that's something you want to try, I think you should go for it and just see what you learn from an exercise like that. But eventually you will probably get to the point where you can kind of skip that step because it's already kind of in your brain. Ideally, you don't want to have to draw geometric shapes every single time you draw a figure, right? You want to get to the point where you've practiced enough and it's kind of in your mental library where you don't necessarily have to draw every single shape. I'm not saying you won't have guidelines, like obviously I still have some guidelines, but it isn't highly detailed guides every time. This is also the step where I start more consciously paying attention to basic proportions. Here are some important proportions that I like to keep on the forefront of my mind. From the bottom of the foot to the groin should be about the same height as from the groin to the top of the head. So basically, the upper body is the same height as the lower body. Now, this proportion gets pushed a lot, especially in some styles that give characters ridiculously long legs. But it is still important to know the general rule before you go around trying to break it. Some other proportions that I think are useful: the upper leg and the lower leg should be about the same length. The length of the upper arm from the shoulder to the elbow is about the same as from the shoulder to the waist, so the elbow is about at belly button height. I also like to note that if the arm is down at the side, the fingertips will reach about mid-thigh, and that means that the wrist reaches about at the top of the leg. And so that's good to know. Also, upper arm and lower arm tend to be similar length. Those tend to be the main proportions that I take note of, mostly because in the past I have made mistakes with those proportions. But keeping a simple proportion reference sheet like this one handy can be very helpful, especially if you are struggling with proportions and you just kind of need a nice little reminder. Once you have reached the stage, once you get to this part where you have your line of action, you have the flow of the pose, you have started adding in your basic shapes, and you kind of know what's going on, you've tackled the most important part. Like, at this point, filling in the character and cleaning the character up and figuring out maybe any specific anatomy, it's all just icing on the cake, because here you can already tell it is a character with some movement, apparently Sailor Moon. And like she already reads. Now it's all just about polish. It's just frosting on the cake. So now you might be wondering, well, okay, but now I don't know how these specific muscles look, or I don't know how this particular part of anatomy looks now that you're trying to like clean stuff up. And honestly, when you reach this point, if you are having trouble with a very specific part of anatomy, first of all, totally normal, totally okay. But the way that you figure it out is you have to start looking up that specific reference, and maybe taking the photo reference of yourself or a friend. If you're like, I don't know how a knee looks at this angle, well, it would be a really good idea to go and find reference of that so you can learn what that specific piece of anatomy looks like. And the way that I've kind of learned anatomy, not that I am a huge expert, but I do have a mental library of quite a bit of anatomy. And the way that I've picked that up is I've done gesture drawings like this. And then when I reach this more detailed stage, if I run into something where I'm like, I'm not quite sure what that looks like, I have to go and just find photos, look it up, see what's going on, and then slowly you accumulate that knowledge where as you continue doing these gesture drawings, you can just pull that knowledge out of your head from your past experiences. But since this is specifically a posing tutorial, I'm not going to go into hyper specifics of any one piece of anatomy. Instead, what I want to move on to is showing you how I use these basic principles to try and just sketch some poses from imagination. If you are a beginner, or even if you're not a beginner, I recommend starting out with using reference. Do a bunch of sketches from reference to kind of get some really loose poses going on before you move on to doodling some pose ideas from imagination like we're going to do here. But let's talk about drawing from imagination. So you will notice that I started out with a line of action that actually matched many of the line of actions that I was seeing in the reference that we were working from earlier. And that's because this kind of line of action is sort of in my mental library because I was working from reference. And then I added in the shoulders and the hips, added the very loose like torso bean, and then notice how the hip is higher on the leg that's bearing the weight, and then started adding in very loosely the limbs, the arms, and the legs. So it's basically a very sketchy and rough advanced stick figure. And I don't spend very much time on things like the head. I want to get the basic head angle and kind of the right size, but I actually don't really care all that much about the head at this point. And I'm just trying to get a fun, lively gesture down. And the point of this exercise is to just practice drawing some poses from imagination, seeing what you can come up with, and then maybe there will be something interesting that you can use later on in an illustration if you like. And you'll notice I did start adding in a little bit of the basic shapes as well, but I think that we should move on to the next pose. As you're drawing gestures, try to not get detailed. Don't get too detailed at this stage. Stay loose. And what might help you out with staying loose is using a larger brush. You notice here that this kind of soft, large brush that I'm using is, it's hard to get detailed with a brush like this because it's just too big. And it tends to be how I sketch, is with a slightly larger, softer brush, because it forces me to remain loose in my sketching, which helps keep the sketches lively and helps keep them not stiff. And we really want to avoid stiff sketching, especially when we're trying to come up with these dynamic poses. I think something else that's really important to embrace with this type of sketching is that some of your sketches will come out bad. In fact, a lot of them might come out ugly, and that's totally okay, especially when you first start out. It can take a while to warm up and get some nice looking sketches. So embrace the stick figure, and embrace that some of your sketches are probably not going to be post quality, which is perfectly good. You should be doing a lot of drawing that is not post worthy, as they say in the social media age. So it's a good thing to keep in mind is that not every sketch has to be a masterpiece. And each of these sketches I tried to keep under 2 minutes. So these types of gesture drawings are really good to keep to around 1 to 2 minutes. You can go a little bit longer, but if it helps, set up a timer if you need it. If you have a tendency to go too long, or something else that I used to do in university is I had a sketchbook that I would draw on with a pen, and I would go out to places like coffee shops and where people are moving around to do basically just stick figure gesture drawings. And I would just have a whole sketchbook filled up with stick figures like these, so that later I could look back and see, oh, were there any interesting poses that I want to try redrawing in a more detailed way for a character. You may also notice that a lot of my figure drawings tend to be very curvy. I think that's okay, but it is also important to try and include a little bit of a balance between straights and curves. So a really good place to have some straights, like on the leg, the top of the thigh is a curvy line usually. The back of the thigh is a straight line. And then you alternate for the lower leg. So the front of the shin is obviously a straight line, and then the calf is a curvy line. And those are just kind of good shortcuts to be aware of. And so you can see with this current sketch, I'm kind of trying to pop in a few straights, even though it's generally a pretty curvy pose, like the back of her butt is kind of angled, and just trying to add in, it helps add that energy when you have a little bit of that balance. I would say that for gesture drawing, it's not the most important thing to keep in mind if you're still trying to learn everything else, but if you are looking to add a little bit more design to your gestures, then seeing where you can balance out the straights versus curves could help you out. So that is essentially how I approach drawing poses, you guys. I know that there were some people who were interested in kind of an assignment at the end of tutorials, so I do have an assignment for you. You can use the reference I've provided, or if you want to go and find your own reference or take your own reference. In fact, that might be a really good idea, is to take your own reference. But however you go about it, find some photo reference, sit down, set a timer for maybe like 20 to 30 minutes to sit and sketch essentially stick figures following these steps. Do a line of action, hips, shoulders, and then start sketching in the rest of the figure. So just like I was doing at the end of this video, follow the reference for however many you do. I recommend doing at least 5 sketches, and they can be from like 2 to 3 minute drawings, maybe 1 to 3 minutes. And then after you do a few of those, turn off the reference and try doing a few more just coming from your head. So the assignment is gather reference or use the reference I've provided, draw a page of poses from the reference, really quick gesture drawings, and then turn off the reference and using what you have learned and what you have practiced in the same drawing session, start trying to make up a few loose poses. And I hope it helps you out. I am interested to see what you guys come up with. If you want, you can post your results in the Discord. And I hope this was helpful, you guys. What else is there to say? Thank you so much for all your support. I really appreciate it. You guys are the best. And you guys are what make tutorials like this possible. So thank you so much for being a wonderful patron, and I will talk to you later. See you next time. Bye.